This is a front view of the female reproductive system, and you'll see a side view on the next page. So we'll start with the ovaries. You sort of look at it as something symmetrical, right? Generally speaking. So there'll be two ovaries. There's one on each side. The one on the right here is showing a cross section. So it shows some of the structures that are inside the ovary. The one on the left side is just showing a complete ovary. It has the fallopian tubes and these this funnel-shaped entrance, and those little finger-like projections are called fimbriae, and they're going to pull an ovum into it when it gets released from the ovary. They typically cover a little bit more of the ovary, and just in this illustration, it's separating them so you the distinguishing features between everything. So just going through the parts of the female reproductive system, the ovaries, the function of them is to produce the sex hormones estrogen and progesterone, as well as ova. And if we're just talking about one ova, we call it an ovum. Each ovary contains many follicles, and one will mature per month, give or take. Occasionally you can get two, and we can get situations of twinning, and we'll talk about those in a future video. So with the one ova a month, generally the ovaries kind of take turns each month in releasing an ova. As an application that we'll talk about as we move into the next unit, into Unit C, a follicle houses an oocyte, and that's the primary follicle, and it has 46 chromosomes. And once a month, that oocyte is going to undergo its cell divisions to eventually make an ovum that is what is fertilized and ends up being fertilized into a fertilized egg and making a zygote. And that is going to be through the process of meiosis. So we generally just call sort of anything earlier than an ovum an oocyte, and we call an ovum just that egg that gets fertilized an ovum, even though in meiosis that process becomes a little bit more specific. So the fallopian tubes are also called the oviducts, and that's where the ovum enters, and it enters via those fimbriae, those finger-like projections that are just wrapped around the ovary. The fallopian tubes are about 10 to 12 centimeters long, and they're the site of fertilization. So if we just look back at the diagram, fertilization, in order for it to be an effective fertilization, would happen around the first third. So the ovum gets released, but then the sperm have made their way all the way up to that area, because there needs to be enough cell divisions that happen all the way down for a successful implantation to have occurred. Those fallopian tubes then merge into the uterus, and it's sort of pear-shaped upside down. And there's three layers to the uterus. The muscular layer that you see in images, and it usually looks striated, is the myometrium. Of course, there's a peritoneum, which is like what all of our organs have in order to attach them to our abdominal wall. The myometrium is the actual muscle of the uterus. And then the endometrium is a temporary layer that builds every month, and then it's shed at the end of each month. And the purpose of it is to provide nourishment and diffusion of gases for a potential fertilized egg as it implants inside that endometrium. So just looking down at the diagram here, you can see the uterus is being shown as this muscle here, and you can often see that it's a muscle by the striation. So that's the muscular part, or the myometrial part of the uterus. The cervix is right here. If you flip back to the other diagram, it just separates the uterus from the vagina. The dilation of the cervix allows for birth, for that fetus to enter the birth canal. It's a separator of those two areas. Intercourse doesn't go past the cervix. The cervix can actually regulate open and closed. It's usually more open during times of ovulation to allow sperm to go up, but otherwise it's a bit protective too, in terms of protecting a baby that's inside or protecting the internal organs from infection. The vagina is the canal that connects the uterus to the outside environment, right after the cervix, also called the birth canal. Sexual intercourse occurs in that vagina. It's very acidic, and like we talked about in the other video, that is why the sperm have an alkaline nature to them, so that they can counteract that acidity. Otherwise, they would die when they're in there. And because the vagina is an internal structure, it's at body temperature, so it needs some protective mechanism against infection, and one of those is being acidic. So in the sperm's journey in terms of reproduction is that sperm get deposited in the vagina, they're going to swim past the cervix and more likely to swim past it during a time of fertility, right, of ovulation, into the uterus and then up the fallopian tubes. Some go one way, some go the other, and the egg is only on one of those sides. There is some research that has been done as to whether there's a preference, and there is some indication that there could be preference to sperm and actually knowing which side that the egg is going to be released. When it comes to technologies, tubal ligation is, like a female form of a vasectomy, where the fallopian tubes get tied, so sperm cannot swim towards the egg, and nor can that ovum get down towards the sperm. A pap smear is a test where a probe is inserted into the vagina and cells are scraped from the cervix to test for any abnormal growths that might be causing or might in the future cause cervical cancer. When we look at the feedback loop for the female reproductive system, it starts similar to the male reproductive system with gonadotropic releasing hormones. So we're going to draw the hypothalamus. I'm not going to draw a stimulus because really this is a 28-day cycle. So these feedback loops are a little bit different than the feedback loops that you have looked at before because they can really happen at any time, and they happen a little bit differently every time depending on what's going on in the body. So you have the anterior pituitary that's going to get a signal from the hypothalamus through gonadotropic releasing hormone, and pituitary will secrete two hormones, FSH and LH. And those are the same hormones that you find in the male reproductive system. So even if you were to inject FSH or LH into either a genetic female or a genetic male, you would get the effects extended by the organs that they have. So whether they have ovaries or testes. So they're the same hormones. They're just acting a little differently depending on which body they're in. So in this big box here, and rather than these happening at the same time, one of them happens first, and it's the FSH that happens first. So the FSH targets the ovaries, and in particular, it targets a follicle. So there's a growing follicle in those ovaries that gets targeted by the FSH. And as that follicle grows, it's just one of the cells inside the ovary, and one in particular gets targeted to grow to make an ovum. Now, in some cases, you might have two, right? If there's more FSH than what you would typically see, and you might get the chance of twins, but we're just going to talk about one follicle growing at a time. And that growing follicle, as it matures, it secretes the hormone estrogen. And estrogen is going to have two effects. Estrogen is going to have an effect on decreasing some of these other, but it's also going to have an effect on increasing of LH in particular. So it's going to cause the release of this hormone right here. And that's LH. What will happen is LH will start to increase, and that's going to indicate that the follicle has a very mature ovum inside. And so that now is going to cause ovulation, or the release of that ovum into the fallopian tubes. And when ovulation occurs, that follicle essentially turns into another structure called the corpus luteum. So this is all happening in the ovary. So the follicle is like the house that the ovum grows up in. And then the ovum gets mature enough to leave the house. And now there's an empty house, which is the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum can secrete two hormones. It secretes estrogen and another hormone called progesterone. So when we look at what the functions of these hormones are, I'll list them below. Estrogen has the functions of developing the secondary sex characteristics that are seen at puberty, such as the widening of the hips, the development of the breasts, body hair, and so on. In terms of the menstrual cycle, it causes the stimulation or stimulates the endometrium. And what we mean by that is it causes the endometrium to grow. It causes it to vascularize. And by doing so, it's causing more blood, more nutrients, more oxygen to get to that area to prepare for a potential fertilized egg. Progesterone's responsibility is to maintain the endometrium. And when something is maintaining the endometrium, it means that it is preventing uterine contractions. Oops, wrong one. So it prevents uterine contractions. So it's maintaining it, it's keeping it there in the event that a fertilized egg implants inside it. So maintaining versus stimulating the endometrium. The other thing that happens here is you're going to get a negative feedback onto both of those as those levels get high, and particularly when there is no pregnancy. So that is the sort of general feedback for the female reproductive system. In the next video, I'll go through the menstrual cycle.